The synchronized hum of 6 black armored luxury SUVs sounded like a swarm of mechanical locusts invading the quiet sanctity of the Montana Valley. They tore down the ancestral dirt road, kicking up massive clouds of blinding dust that settled over the pristine green pastures of the Broken Ridge Ranch. Stepping out of the lead vehicle was Julian Vance, a 34-year-old Silicon Valley billionaire who had built his empire on data mining and algorithmic manipulation. Vance adjusted his designer sunglasses, shivering slightly in the crisp mountain air, and looked at the sprawling ranch not as a piece of majestic history, but as a minor geographical inconvenience. He was constructing a multi-billion-dollar subterranean server farm on the adjacent property, a technological fortress that required millions of gallons of continuous, freezing mountain water to cool its massive processors. The only thing standing between Vance and the pure glacial runoff of the Blackfoot River was a 72-year-old cattle rancher named Silas Caldwell. Vance confidently marched up to the weathered wooden porch of the ranch house, flanked by a phalanx of aggressive corporate attorneys carrying glowing tablets. With a condescending smirk that had destroyed countless tech startups, Vance informed Silas that a recently lobbied amendment to the state's digital environmental zoning laws effectively revoked the Caldwell family's access to the river. Vance offered a check that to him was pocket change, but to a simple farmer was supposed to be a fortune. When the old man refused, Vance laughed, promising to send federal bulldozers by Monday morning to forcefully reroute the river, leaving the Caldwell cattle to die in the dust. He thought his unlimited wealth and corrupt digital mapping could erase a century of history in a single afternoon. But Julian Vance was about to learn a terrifying, multi-million-dollar lesson about the unbreakable power of sovereign ink, and how a single, heavy piece of parchment signed during the American Civil War would not only shatter his digital empire, but bring the arrogant billionaire to his knees. If you believe that the roots of an honest man are stronger than the greed of modern corporations, hit the like button and subscribe to Farmer's Verdict. We tell the true stories of the quiet titans who refuse to surrender their legacy. To fully grasp the catastrophic weight of the mistake Julian Vance was making, you have to look past the rusted tractors and deeply examine Silas Caldwell. Silas was a man carved from the very granite of the Montana mountains. His face was a topographic map of 50 years of grueling labor, lined with deep creases from squinting into blizzard winds and the blistering August sun. His hands were thick, heavily calloused, and permanently stained with machine grease and rich earth. He knew the precise metallic smell of impending snow and the comforting rhythmic sound of a diesel engine firing up at 4 in the morning. Broken Ridge wasn't just a real estate asset. It was the sacred ground where his bloodline had bled, wept, and triumphed. It was the exact pasture where his great-grandfather, a scarred veteran of the Union Army, had first broken the hardened soil in 1865. It was the porch where Silas had watched his own children take their first steps, and the very same porch where he had held his wife's hand as she took her final breath. The river that Vance wanted to steal wasn't just water. It was the lifeblood of the Caldwell legacy. Silas remembered the devastating drought of 1988, when he had manually hauled buckets of water from the deep wells for 18 hours a day just to keep his calves from perishing. He belonged to a generation that understood that a man's worth was measured by the sweat on his brow and the iron of his word, not the numbers glowing on a digital screen. The nightmare had materialized with brutal efficiency just 3 weeks prior. Julian Vance's tech conglomerate, Omni Data Corp, had descended upon the valley like a plague. Using their immense capital, they bought up the local municipal debts, funded the campaigns of sympathetic county commissioners, and essentially took control of the local government. They needed to divert the river to their server cooling facility, and the Caldwell Ranch was the final puzzle piece. When Vance stood on Silas's porch, he didn't even bother to feign respect. He projected a highly sophisticated, three-dimensional topographical map from his tablet onto the side of Silas's ancient barn. With the smug patience of a professor lecturing a failing student, Vance explained that the state's newly digitized water registry, a registry Vance's own company had helped design, showed a critical anomaly. According to the modern database, the Caldwell's riparian rights had technically expired due to a reclassification of environmental zones in 1999. Vance chuckled, a dry, soulless sound, tapping his expensive screen. He told Silas that he understood how confusing modern bureaucracy must be for someone who still used a rotary telephone. He offered a predatory smile and a settlement contract, threatening that if Silas didn't sign, the legal fees alone would bankrupt him before the case even reached a judge. Vance promised to shut down the main irrigation gates by force, deploy private armed security to the riverbanks, and watch the legendary Broken Ridge Ranch turn into a barren graveyard of dry bones. Vance was absolutely certain of his victory. He had crushed countless opponents with this exact strategy of digital manipulation and overwhelming financial force. He truly believed that reality only existed if it was verified by a server. Silas didn't yell. He didn't threaten the billionaire with the shotgun resting just inside the door frame. He simply looked down at Vance's spotless, custom-made leather shoes, which had never seen a day of honest work, and closed the heavy oak door without uttering a single word. But when the latch clicked shut, the overwhelming gravity of the threat brought Silas to his knees. The deafening silence of the old farmhouse pressed down on him like physical weight. He had spent his last available funds consulting a seasoned property attorney in Helena, only to be met with a look of profound pity. The lawyer had explained that fighting a billion-dollar tech giant over a digitized zoning glitch was a suicide mission. The legal system had evolved to favor the wealthy and the connected. The lawyer had gently advised him to take the buyout and live out his final years in a comfortable condo. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge's gavel counting down the final hours of the Caldwell legacy. By 2 a.m, Silas was pacing the worn wooden floors, the bitter smell of stale black coffee filling the air. He refused to believe that his great-grandfather's sacrifices could be deleted by a computer glitch. Silas remembered a story his father had told him around a crackling campfire 50 years ago. A story about a fire in the county courthouse in 1922 that had destroyed all local property records. The state had reissued new deeds, but his father always claimed that their true authority didn't come from the county or even the state. It came from something much older, something kept hidden. Silas grabbed a heavy iron flashlight and marched out into the freezing night, the wind biting fiercely through his flannel coat. He headed toward the oldest structure on the property, the original stone smokehouse built in the 1870s. The air inside smelled of century-old hickory smoke and damp earth. Silas began a desperate, agonizing excavation. His arthritic hands ached as he tore through decades of accumulated history. He sifted through rotting canvas tarps, rusted farrier tools, and heavy iron chains. Hours bled together in a blur of exhaustion and panic. The harsh beam of the flashlight flickered as he ripped up the heavy stone floorboards, choking on clouds of gray, suffocating dust. Nothing. The suffocating grip of defeat began to tighten around his chest. Was Vance right? Was the modern world too powerful to fight? Exhausted and trembling, Silas collapsed onto a pile of old timber. But as his hand brushed against the stone wall, he felt an unnatural void behind a loose mortar joint. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed a rusted iron crowbar and drove it into the gap, prying the heavy stone loose with a violent crack. Tucked deep inside a hidden lead-lined cavity was a heavy, brass-bound strongbox. The brass was completely black, with a century of tarnish, the lock fused shut by time. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought the crowbar down with all his remaining strength, shattering the ancient mechanism. He threw open the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dry, crumbling tobacco leaves, was a thick, oiled leather tube. Silas's trembling hands opened the cap and carefully pulled out a pristine, heavy piece of vellum parchment. It wasn't a state deed. It wasn't a local zoning permit. It was an original, unalterable, United States sovereign land patent. Silas read the elegant, fading calligraphy in the dim yellow light, and a slow, fierce fire ignited in his soul. The document was dated 1862. It bore the heavy, raised wax seal of the United States federal government, and at the bottom, signed in bold, unmistakable ink, was the signature of President Abraham Lincoln. Silas hadn't just found a piece of paper. He had found the ultimate weapon. 3 days later, the federal district courtroom in Helena was a chaotic circus of reporters, local politicians, and neighboring ranchers. Julian Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, looking utterly bored, flanked by 5 corporate attorneys tapping away on sleek laptops. He was dressed in a pristine tailored suit, exuding the arrogant aura of a man who owned the room. Silas sat alone at his table, wearing a clean but faded corduroy jacket, his calloused hands resting calmly on the heavy leather tube. The federal judge, a severe woman with sharp features and zero tolerance for corporate games, called the court to order. Vance's lead attorney stood up and delivered a polished, incredibly arrogant monologue about modernization, digital infrastructure, and the absolute infallibility of the newly updated state environmental registry. They demanded an immediate federal injunction to seize the Caldwell water rights and forcefully evict the old man. The judge turned her piercing gaze to Silas. She asked, with a hint of genuine sympathy, if the defendant had any physical evidence to present that could possibly challenge the digital records of the state and the immense legal arguments of Omni Data Corps. Silas stood up slowly. He didn't use the microphone. He didn't look at the army of lawyers. He walked directly to the judge's bench with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who carried the weight of the mountains, and placed the pristine 1862 vellum parchment directly onto her desk. The boy in the expensive suit claims my river belongs to his computers because a state database forgot to check a box, Silas said, his voice deep, resonant, and echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. But my great-grandfather didn't bleed for a digital database, and he didn't sign a contract with the state of Montana. He signed it with the President of the United States. The courtroom held its collective breath. The judge put on her reading glasses and leaned over the document. The silence was so profound, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The judge's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as she touched the raised wax seal. Then, her expression hardened into absolute cold fury as she fixed her gaze directly on the arrogant billionaire. Quote 2, the judge said, her voice dripping with lethal ice. Quote 3. Julian Vance stood up, his arrogant smirk finally beginning to crack, annoyance flashing in his eyes. He stammered that any legacy document was naturally superseded by the modern state digital master file. Quote 4, quote, the judge fired back, her voice booming like thunder through the room, slamming her hand flat on the desk. Quote 5. Quote, the judge looked back at the document, a fierce predatory smile touching her lips. The blood drained from Julian Vance's face. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. His attorneys stopped typing, their faces pale with catastrophic panic as they realized the apocalyptic magnitude of their mistake. Quote 7 the judge continued, grabbing her heavy wooden gavel. Quote 8. Quote, the judge raised the gavel high. Quote 9. Quote, the crack of the gavel echoed like a rifle shot. Julian Vance collapsed into his chair, his immaculate suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. He stared blankly at the floor, completely ruined, hyperventilating as the reality of his defeat crushed him. He had been destroyed by the one thing his billions couldn't hack, delete, or buy.
Silas didn't gloat. He didn't cheer, and he didn't even look back at the broken billionaire. He carefully rolled the parchment back into the leather tube, tucked it under his arm, tipped his weathered hat to the judge, and walked out of the heavy oak doors into the bright Montana sunlight. That evening, the sky over Broken Ridge exploded in brilliant, breathtaking shades of bruised purple and burning gold. The corporate SUVs were gone, banished from the valley forever. Silas sat on his porch, the old wood groaning comfortably beneath his rocking chair. The air smelled of sweet pine and the distant, roaring promise of the Blackfoot River flowing freely through his land. He held a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee, watching his cattle graze peacefully in the fading light. He didn't celebrate his millions. He didn't plan to change a single thing about his life. Tomorrow morning, long before the sun crested the mountains, he would wake up, pull on his heavy boots, and go check the fence line, exactly as his father had done, and exactly as his great-grandfather had done before him. The modern world is obsessed with the illusion of control. Entitled people and faceless corporations believe that reality only exists on screens, and that men with enough money and technology can rewrite history whenever they please. They rely on intimidation and digital manipulation to crush the honest working class. But they fundamentally underestimate the deep, unyielding roots of the people who actually built this world. You cannot digitize a lifetime of honest sweat, and you can never delete a promise forged in sovereign ink and sealed with the blood of an American legacy. Truth, just like the mountains themselves, outlasts every storm, ready to break the foundation of any lie built above it. Keep standing your ground.